All right, good morning. Blessing to be here this morning. Glad to see all of you here with us as we come together this Lord's Day. I do want to make one quick announcement here. We are planning a men's retreat. That is coming up October 22nd and 23rd. So please, yeah, well, it won't be as fun as it normally is because Sonny won't be there. There's no one to, there's always somebody to pick on. Just not as somebody as fun as you to pick on. So, what? 21 and 20? Is it? If you're going on Thursday. Oh, yes. Yeah, okay, thank you. So I got these women telling me what's happening on the men's day, but so, which I need that because apparently I can't remember. So there are some of us that leave on Thursday. So if you want to go up on Thursday, that's available. So, but typically most go on 22nd and 23rd. Get with me. We'll get into more information. I'll explain to you what we're going to do up there. And so just keep that on your calendar. We missed it last year. We didn't get to go because of what was going on. So it is available this year. All right. So I'm going to do a 3-part series. 2 of the lessons you're going to be familiar with. The third one, the conclusion, you won't be. I'm going to, because of what I've been seeing out there a lot recently regarding the mandate, the vaccine. I was talking to the elders about this, and it's similar to what we saw with the COVID rules of wearing masks and not coming together and the restrictions and so forth. And I was talking to the elders and I said, let's try to get ahead of the game with this and see if we can answer this from a biblical viewpoint and try to understand what God does or does not permit in regards to this vaccine mandate. And some may say, well, that's not really a biblical discussion or topic. I say, yes, it is. And I'll explain why in just a little bit. Why is something that we need to consider. So this morning what we're going to do is we're going to begin in Romans chapter 13 and discussing this. Now, there's been a lot spoken of lately about government intrusion upon religious liberties. So you hear that in the news on a regular basis. And one of the most current situations is this dealing with the vaccine mandate of COVID-19. So it's whether or not the government has a right to mandate to the people that they need to go out there and get this vaccine. Now, let me say this. Government mandates are nothing new, okay? This is not something that somebody woke up to all of a sudden vaccine mandate, though, I've never heard of that before. Everybody sitting here has been vaccinated to go to public school. I've got my records that show, and they wouldn't let me. I'd have my vaccine records to get in there. If you were in the military, you were mandated to get vaccinated before you went into the military. And I'm not just talking about that. There's all kinds of government mandates out there. We're going to put up a new sign for the church. We have to go get a permit to do that. Permitted, that's a mandate. You can't just go throw up. You can't just build a building wherever you want to build, however you want to build it. Speed limits are mandated. So government mandates are not something that are unusual to our society. In fact, the Constitution has mandates. It's built upon the premise of mandates, freedoms, and restrictions. So this is not something that is new to us. What is new to us is this idea of what we're seeing currently with this COVID situation and the desire to have a religious exemption from it. And that's why this becomes a topic from the Bible. There has been a lot of discussion out there on whether or not, as a Christian, and this is one of the reasons I'm going to bring it up, I'm going to show you in just a second, on whether or not Christians can claim religious exemption of what the government is mandating as a violation of their belief system. So is that something that is okay for Christians to do? Let me share with you this article that comes from the CBS News. And CBS News, in this article, I'm just going to read parts of it. Sweeping new vaccine mandates could force millions of vaccine holdouts to become inoculated against COVID-19, although individuals of faith or people with disabilities may still be exempt from getting jabbed. Employers with vaccine mandates in place already report being inundated with worker requests for exemption for any requirement to get their shots. Roughly 2,600 Los Angeles Police Department employees are claiming religious objections and to the department's COVID-19 vaccination requirement, according to the Associated Press. And in Washington State, some 3,800 state workers have requested religious exemptions to Governor Jay Inslee's mandate that workers be fully vaccinated by October 18th or lose their job unless they receive an accommodation. It's new territory for many employers navigating this issue, given how risky a proposition it is to allow unvaccinated employees to mingle with and possibly infect colleagues in the workplace. Now they go on to say, no major religious denomination in the U.S. opposes vaccination outright, but an individual's sincerely held religious belief does not have to be part of an organized religion mandate to be considered a valid reason for exemption from getting the vaccine. So, this is something that is being faced out there in the public already. We already have people in the church who are saying, is this something that I have to do? I don't want to do this. Do I have to do this? That makes it something where we're saying, are we in violation of Romans chapter 13? Are we in violation of 1 Peter in chapter 2? We're going to be taking a look at those. So are we violating the law that we are told to be subject to if we are refusing to do this? Here's one of the reasons this is important for discussion as well. You've heard recently where many employees in the medical profession are being fired from their jobs because they're refusing to do this. Now, I don't want to get too far into the weeds, but it's curious to me when people in the medical profession are refusing to do it, that they are considered quacks, and the people who are doing it aren't, and they're in the same profession, and they're on equal par with one another, but let's not get too off into the weeds with that one. And I like the post that said, we were last year's heroes, we are this year's enemies, right? Last year they were heroes fighting this whole thing without vaccines, but now they're getting fired from their jobs. That's an important subject matter because if you are in a profession where you may be fired from your job, then you need to be able to ask yourself and defend, do you object to this on religious principle? Is there a place for you to actually do that? I can tell you this, both the Catholic Church and the Mormons have come out and adamantly stated that they do not support opposing vaccinations. They do not speak for the church. They speak for their particular denomination. They don't speak for the church. So, and I know that because they are large bodies that people will appeal to them as an authority as well. If they're saying you can't do it, then, you know, the church says you can't do it. They're not the church, okay? And regardless of that fact, the law of the government provides an individual choice in this. It doesn't have to be something, even if your particular denomination does not agree with it, that does not mean that you are mandated to that denomination's teaching, because this is an individual choice. It's always been that way. You don't even have to be part of a church. In fact, in times past, it was commonplace that they really did not fuss too much about the issue of religious accommodations. It was like, you don't want to work on the Sabbath because you don't believe in working. That's a strongly held belief of yours. Fine, then we won't require you to work on Saturday. And companies would accommodate for that. But because of what they're saying with COVID and all the things and the sickness, and then all of a sudden it becomes a gray area. And I think there's a danger in doing that, where all of a sudden you get to pick and choose what actually is a religious accommodation and what all of a sudden no longer is a religious accommodation. So, with that being said, we need to ask ourselves and try to determine whether or not we can, if you're a Christian and if you are opposed to it, and I'm going to say this ahead of time, this is getting to my third lesson, this is going to be a matter of opinion for you. And there is room in the text for your opinion in this matter. So a brother sitting next to you may be very serious that he believes you need to get the shot. But as a Christian, you have the right to yourself say, I don't believe that I want to take that shot. And I will show you in the third lesson. So if you don't make it next week or the week after, then you're just going to be out in the weeds, and I don't know what's going to happen to you. You'll probably lose your job. Now, I will post these they'll be on our YouTube channel, so you can go there. They'll be on our website, so you can go there, and you can take a look at these, and if you can't make it to all the lessons. So, where does the requirement to adhere to the government come into play in the Christian walk? Christians are commanded to subject themselves to governing authorities. Okay? That is a command. There's a command, and I go, oh. You know, it's like when you start reading a book. When you start reading a book, don't jump to conclusions. Just ride the book out. So ride the lesson out. Before you start chasing rabbits in your head and going off into some direction, this is a true statement. You cannot argue against this. But that's not the whole of the discussion. So we want to be honest with our approach. We want to look at exactly what the scriptures say and then determine, is this something that we can be opposed to or not? So the bottom line is Christians are commanded to subject themselves to the governing authorities. So let's take a look at the command. The command to subject is found over in Romans chapter 13, verses 1 through 7. And I apologize for this being small. I'm actually using key point, and I usually use PowerPoint, and I like this one better, and I'm not used to the size of the letters. They're different from PowerPoint, but I'll get it figured out. Every person, Romans 13, and this is 1 through 7. Every person is to be subject to the governing authorities, for there is no authority except from God, and those which exist are established by God. Therefore, whoever resists authority has opposed the ordinance of God, and they who have opposed will receive condemnation upon themselves. For rulers are not a cause of fear for good behavior, but for evil. Do you want to have no fear of authority? Do what is good, and you will have praise from the same. For it is a servant of God to you for good. But if you do what is evil, be afraid, for it does not bear the sword for nothing, for it is a servant of God, an avenger who brings wrath on the one who practices evil. Therefore it is necessary to be in subjection, not only because of wrath, but also for sake of conscience. For because of this you also pay taxes, for rulers are servants of God, devoting themselves to this very thing. Pay to all what is due them, tax to whom tax is due, custom to whom custom, respect to whom respect, honor to whom honor. All right, so that is the passage and the area we're going to be looking at this morning. I am going to be talking about 1 Peter here a little bit, but that's a lesson for next week. But I'm just going to bring part of this subject matter in. So God instructs twice within this passage that there is a command to be subject to these authorities. Every person is to be subject to the governing authorities. He says that in verse 1 and in verse 5. Therefore, it is necessary to be in subjection. So twice we have this command stating that we are to subject ourselves to these governing authorities. Now, Peter also mentions something similar to this in 1 Peter chapter 2, 13 through 14. Submit yourselves for the Lord's sake to every human institution, whether to a king as one in authority or to governors as sent by him for the punishment of evildoers and the praise of those who do right. So Peter talks about something very similar. He uses different terminology, but the bottom line, the authorities are going to be the same in either Romans or in 1 Peter. So what we want to do now is define this word subject, right? Subject, because that's what we're being told to do. Subject yourselves. Well, it means to be subject to. To be subject to, signifying to place oneself under subjection, to render oneself subordinate. To be submissive is to be or become inclined or willing to submit to orders or wishes of others or showing such an inclination. The word is also a present tense verb. It is a continual action with no assessment of completion. Now, that means each individual is responsible to take this upon themselves. You be in subjection. You make this decision. You subject yourself, and you do it on a continual basis. Nowhere does it say, now, just, you don't want to do it anymore, it's okay, go ahead and just stop. You don't have to do it anymore. That's not what this passage indicates. It's a continual process that Christians are to subject themselves to governing authorities. All right. Now, if we're going down to Romans 13 and then including 1 Peter chapter 2 in here, we have governing authorities, but we also have every ordinance of man. And that's mentioned over in 1 Peter and chapter 2. So in Romans 13:1, authority refers to a person who exercises administrative control over others. So they are administrative control over someone else. In this case, Romans, we're dealing with political governments. It can be a federal or the top, whatever country you would be in, government. It could be local governments. It could be municipalities if you're talking about county. And we know this in our own world. We have federal government, we have state government, we have county government, we have city government, right? And each one of those has different rules, and sadly, each one of them wants to tax you. I won't get up into that one, but I don't know why everybody thinks they should tax you all the way down to the bottom of it, and then you're left with nothing. But pay taxes to whom taxes, right? That's what we're supposed to be doing. So authority is one who exercises administrative control. In 1 Peter 2:13, we have ordinance, and it literally means a creation, right? So the ordinance is a creation. It is a creation that is brought about, one, through God, but the laws are those things which are brought through by man. So both of these passages are speaking of the same institution. One just words it a little differently. We're dealing with ordinances, rules, regulations, laws, whatever they may be, that are put up by society for us to subject ourselves to. So, we have to willingly submit ourselves to the laws of our land. We have a thing called a constitution that we adhere to, and we have certain rights and privileges in that constitution. We have a government, we have a federal government, we have a state government, we have a county government, and we have a city government, and we adhere to particular regulations, zoning laws, whatever it may be, under those as well. God wants his children to respond to local governments in such a way as to not bring harm upon themselves. We don't want to interfere and be insurrectionists and rise up in situations that are not necessary, that would cause harm to the work of God, the church itself. And so there's a caution there in that even in times of extreme persecution, as we will see when we get to 1 Peter, they were still told not to rise up against those governments, not to act in an unchristian way to governments that were even persecuting them, that their demeanor, their behavior was always to be in line with the character of Christ, to follow the example that he had set before them. So Christians are commanded to subject themselves to governing authorities. You cannot read Romans 13 and conclude that you have no responsibility, no obligation to heed to what the governing authorities tell you to do. Look, here's the outcome of it. Just try it. Just try to live in this country, in this state, in this city, in this county, in this city, and just don't obey the laws. Unless you are inclined to do prison ministry, you will be hauled off and you will be put in jail. It'll just be that simple. And you will impugn the work of God. Because your argument will be, well, I just don't want to subject myself to governing authorities. They have no right. God is my king. Jesus is my Lord. They have no right to put these things upon me. Well, what are you doing in jail? Well, because I didn't care that the speed limit said 35 through a school zone. I wanted to do 150 in my new Corvette. And you're not going to tell me what I can and cannot do. Obviously, by the fact that you're sitting in this jail and you no longer own that Corvette, you can't be told what to do. Because here you are. So that impugns the work of Christ. Because all I have to do is turn to Romans chapter 13 and say, yes, except for we are told to subject ourselves to governing authorities. So you are actually not following what the scriptures teach. You're violating God's will in this matter. And that's not boding very well for you. So we understand that even if we hope to live in a godless world, under a godless government, and do the work of God, that we've got to subject ourselves where we can so that we can carry out the work of God. We understand that. And that is what we're being told to do in Romans. You think that the Roman government was a Christian government just out there for the good of all those Christians? No, not at all. Not at all. They tolerated them. And so the Christians tolerated, under command of God, the laws of the government so they could continue to the work that God intended them to do. All right, here's the reason for subjection. That's found in verses 1 through 7. Every person is to be subject to the governing authorities, for there is no authority except from God, and those which exist are established by God. Paul goes on to say that if you oppose those authorities, then you are opposing God. So again, the need to be in subjection to those authorities is biblical. And if you oppose that which God has established, then in fact you are opposing God and the work that he would have you to do as you sojourn here on this earth. Now, we can show that the governing authorities exist from God. It's always been that way. Daniel chapter 2:21. It is he who changes the times and the periods. He removes kings and appoints king. He gives wisdom to wise men and knowledge to people of understanding. God does that. So God is the one who brings up the governments and takes down the governments. We see it in Daniel 4 as well, verse 17. This sentence is by decree of the angelic watchers, and the decision is a command of the holy ones, in order that the living may know that the Most High is ruler over the realm of mankind, and he grants to whomever he wishes, and he sets over it the lowest of people. God is in control. God is in control. And God will even use wicked nations to carry out his plans. If you want to go back and read Habakkuk, in Habakkuk we are told that God is going to bring up an Assyrian nation, a godless people, to bring down his people, because his people have departed from him. So God will even use godless nations to accomplish his work. He doesn't make them godless. That's the choice they make. He will just use them for his purpose. So whether it is a government that is upholding the rights of its society or a government that's violating human rights, God is in control of these. And he tells us that we are to be in subjection to these governing authorities. To resist these authorities then is to resist God. Therefore, whoever resists authority has opposed the ordinance of God, and they who have opposed will receive condemnation upon themselves. For rulers are not a cause of fear for good behavior, but for evil. Do you want to have no fear of authority? Do what is good, and you will have praise from the same. For it is a servant of God to you for good. But if you do what is evil, be afraid, for it does not bear the sword for nothing. For it is a servant of God, an avenger who brings wrath on the one who practices evil. So if we stand opposed to these authorities, then we are resisting God. We're standing opposed to him. So again, if you go out there and you just want to live a lawless life and violate the laws of the country or state or county or city that you live in, then you are in opposition to God in doing such, and you yourself will be condemned for those actions. Submitting to the governing authorities is the will of God. Again, in 1 Peter 2:13, submit yourselves for the Lord's sake to every human institution, whether to a king as to one in authority, or to governors as sent by him for punishment of evildoers and the praise of those who are doing right. For such is the will of God. There is no way you can argue that the call to subject ourselves to governing authorities is against the will of God. On the contrary, we are to be in subjection to those authorities. That's what the scriptures teach. And so we must be willing to adhere to what the scriptures are teaching. Again, this is the will of God, and it is for the Lord's sake that we are doing these things. You know, and I understand that it's not always easy to do that. There are times, I don't know if you've ever seen the story about the guy in Colorado who just finally decided to take that bulldozer and he turned it into a tank, and he just went through, I want to say it was Kremlin that he was at, but he just decided to plow the town down. because he had felt he had been wronged all these years, not only by people, but by those who sat on the city council and the board. He was just trying to destroy everything. He was going to show them. He ended up, dying. He killed himself because he got his thing stuck and there was no way out. And so then he finally just shot himself. But that was his revenge. I'm going to show you. Well, I'm sorry, Christians. And look, granted, I understand his plight. I'm going to listen to the story, how he felt like his land was being robbed from him, and it was. People got on the board in order to try to take away land. I don't know if you heard about this recently in California. There was a park. There's a park in California on the coast that was taken from a black family years ago back in the 20s. And the report shows all the neighbors didn't want these black people in their neighborhood. So the city, what's that called? That eminent domain. Did eminent domain on them and took their land from them. They just ruled that they need to give that land back to the heirs of this. Because they just decided, we don't want you people here, so we're going to take your land from you. Let me tell you what, if you're those people, you think you're going to be a little bitter? You think you work for this and now they're just stealing? And how can you just steal this? I paid for this, is mine. Well, we think it's better use if we put a park bench in it than for you to have a business there. And they just took it from them. I can understand the frustration. You hear it all the time where you have evil people in government who is working to get what they can. They're going to use the government to get the money that they want, the position and power, and they'll run right over people. They don't care. You can understand why people would get upset over that. That doesn't provide an excuse for us to take a dozer, turn it into a tank, and begin to destroy the town. We don't have the right to do that, right? Sometimes, for the Lord's sake, we just take it. We just take it. And we say, fine, my reward isn't here anyway. That is your reward. You'll get my land. You'll get my business. More power to you. I serve a king that has a kingdom not of this world. And you just have to deal with that. I'm not saying it's going to be easy. It's not. It's frustrating. But we have to be in subjection. So subjection silences the ignorance of foolish men. Christians were often falsely accused of crimes that they never committed. Acts chapter 17. But the Jews, becoming jealous and taking along some wicked men from the marketplace, formed a mob and set the city in an uproar, and they attacked the house of Jason and were seeking to bring them out to the people. When they did not find them, they began dragging Jason and some brothers before the city authorities, shouting, "These men have upset the whole world." Oh my word, the whole world? Okay, well, that's a little bit of an exaggeration there. The whole world have come here also, and Jason has welcomed them, and they act contrary to the decrees of Caesar, saying there is another King Jesus. They stirred up the crowd and the city's authorities who heard these things. How many times do we see Jesus being falsely accused? How many times do we see Peter and Paul? How many times do we see these people being falsely accused? John was thrown into prison. Peter was thrown into prison. Time and again, Christians were falsely accused. And none of them took up arms to destroy their oppressors. They subjected themselves to the governing authorities, putting their faith in Christ. And that silenced the ignorance of the people that are doing this, because it proves that what they're saying actually is not true. The character of this individual is not what you are saying. They've never done such a thing. They're not even acting that way now. So submitting to governing authorities avoids God's wrath and that of the governing authorities, and allows us to have a good conscience. He says in Romans 13, "For it is a servant of God to you for good, but if you do what is evil, be afraid, for it does not bear the sword for nothing. For it is a servant of God, an avenger, who brings wrath on the one who practices evil. Therefore, it is necessary to be in subjection, not only because of wrath, but also for sake of conscience." So you can know that they may be unjust and what they're doing is not right, but you stand in good conscience before God and before them. Because no matter how they accuse you, oh, that person, he's always trying to figure out ways to do this and do that. And you're like, no, I'm not. I never have, and neither will I do it now when you're accusing me of doing that. My character is such that I will never act in that way. So as for you to have support for your argument. Remember the time you got really upset? downtown, and that guy said that, and you took your pickup truck, and you ran through the front door. Remember that time? Yeah, well, don't tell me you're not. Well, you're never going to catch us doing that. So anything you want to accuse me of is just going to have to be brought out of thin air. I stand with good conscience before those people and before God because I willingly subject myself. Hang on. We decided to take a detour here. All right. All right, so let's look at one other point here, and we'll close out. An exception to the rule. An exception to the rule. There is an exception to this rule. So when we look at this command that we are to adhere to governing authorities, there is a place, and I'm going to show you two, but there's actually a third one, and that's going to be the last lesson we're going to be talking about, the third lesson in this series. There is a place where we can say that what the government is asking us to do, we cannot do because it is a violation of the will of God. And I think we can all understand that, the principle of that, and agree to that if the government is asking you to accept something, to participate in something, to behave in such a way that violates, live in such a way that violates the will of God, then you cannot commit yourself to that. Let me give you an example of where you see this being played out right now. So under these new health care laws that we find, there have been propositions put forth that doctors must perform abortions if they're asked under these certain requirements. But there are doctors out there that are opposed to that. And they're saying that, and you even saw this in the insurance argument when we had this insurance mandate, that in these mandates, the government was saying you have to provide in your insurance policy, and as a company, you have to provide insurance that provides for abortions. Well, we know that Hobby Lobby fought that and won. That they were saying we are opposed as a religious family, we are opposed to providing insurance, being forced to provide insurance that provides abortion. We don't agree with that. And the court sided with them. That is one of those things that if you as an individual are being forced to commit an act that is contrary to the will of God, God comes first in that discussion. Now, there may be a price to pay. You may go to jail. Fine. Go to jail. You may lose your livelihood. Fine. Lose your livelihood. But you cannot, as a Christian, violate the commands of God. The government limitations is not whenever the government is oppressive. Well, they're an oppressive government. Let me just put it this way. Governments always have been and always will be oppressive. To greater or lesser degrees, I'm just telling you, I got to stop reading this book because it's depressing. I'm reading this book on, the beginning of the book is tragedy and hope. I haven't found the hope yet. All I keep reading about tragedy in governments. It's horrible. It's horrible. And they've always been this way. And I don't care if it's America with its Constitution. When you can take Japanese Americans and stick them in an internment camp in their own country and call it justified, that's oppressive. That just appalls me. Because I'm thinking, why didn't you haul off every German and stick them in the internment camps? Because there was a lot of Germans. No, just the Japanese. Because, why? Because Japan attacked Pearl Harbor, so let's throw every Japanese American citizen in prison. Let's take away their livelihood. Let's take away their possessions. Their homes are gone. Their jobs are gone. But we feel good. Okay. So, governments are oppressive. And sometimes you just have to subject yourself for the Lord's sake and keep doing His work. The early church thrived under governments like this. When we go back and look at the oppression that was on the church, it grew. You know why it grew? It didn't grow because it rose up in retaliation. It thrived because they continued to maintain the Christian character. They continued to show their love for Christ and their belief in his plan, his kingdom, and the outcome of faithfulness. They stayed true to that. And the people saw that. They didn't see a group of guys getting together with Roman spears and attacking everybody that oppressed them. They were subject. First Peter, Christians were under heavy persecution, and they were not told to rise up against their oppressors. They were told to subject themselves, and they did. They were told to maintain a Christian character, and they did. So government limitations, it doesn't, well, you're limited when you become oppressive. Well, then we'd never listen to the government because they're always oppressive. I think taxes can be oppressive. So, oh man, don't even get me started on taxes. I think it's the most ridiculous thing I've ever heard. Acts 4, 8 through 20. And when they had summoned them, they commanded them not to speak or teach at all in the name of Jesus. Here's your two examples. But Peter and John answered and said to them, whether it is right in the sight of God to listen to you rather than to God, make your own judgment. For we cannot stop speaking about what we have seen and heard. You see, there's a limitation. If your government starts saying, you need to stop this Christian nonsense, all churches are shutting down. We're tired of hearing you speak about Jesus. We don't want to hear about how we're living sinful anymore. The LGBTQ, LMNOP, XYZ groups, they're all upset at you now. And you need to stop talking about this nonsense and just shut it up. Because if you just be quiet, everything would be so much better. I will not stop speaking. Put me in jail, kill me. I will not stop speaking. That's what the apostles were saying. You tell us. These were the Sanhedrin, the ruling body of the Jewish people. And they're saying your power is limited. It's limited to the will of God. And once you violate that, you tell us, do we listen to you or do we listen to God? Acts chapter 5. When they had brought them, they said to them and had them stand before them, the council. The high priest interrogated them, saying, we have strict orders. We gave you strict orders not to continue teaching in this name, and yet you have filled Jerusalem with your teaching and intend to bring this man's blood upon us. Well, I don't know. You're the ones that had him crucified. I mean, I don't know if I'm intending to bring it upon you or not, or if that's something actually you just did yourself, because you're the ones that crucified the man. But Peter and the apostles answered, we must obey God rather than men. I love this. Chapter 4, chapter 5. Same group. Now, in this case, it's all the apostles. In the first place, Peter, James, and John. But here's the interesting thing. In the first question, they say, you tell us. The second time they're brought before them, they say, we're just going to tell you. We gave you the option before. You tell us. Is it better to listen to you or to God? Well, we're going to need to talk about this. Think about this. Or you don't even need to think about that. The second time they bring him, they say, what? We must obey God rather than men. That's the exception. So when the government begins to oppress the people in such a way that it restricts them from carrying out their Christian duty, then we have a right. I'm not saying you have a right to go attack and murder and pillage, but you have a right to refuse to stop speaking the message of Christ. You have a right to refuse the command, don't you assemble together. Hebrews 10:25, we're told not to forsake the assembly of ourselves together. So are you commanding us to violate the will of God? Then we can't listen to what you're telling us. So there are areas where we have that right. When those in authority attempt to force us to disobey God, we must disobey the government. This does not allow for complete rejection of government, but it does provide the means to follow God without fear of violating his command of subjection to governing authorities. Because see, that's the conundrum. Well, I'm not going to listen to him because they say I can't speak in his name, but I'm told in Romans 13 to subject myself. 1 Peter chapter 2, subject myself. Then I'm no. You have no fear of violating the command of God if what your government is telling you to do is in violation of the command of God. So we have that on our side. The Christian's duty to government mandates. Christians are commanded to subject themselves to governing authorities. It's that simple. That's not the end of the discussion, though. I mean, it is the end of this lesson, but not the discussion. Next week, we're going to take a look into 1 Peter. It's a very similar argument. And I know we've heard these lessons before, but I wanted to bring them up because I don't want to enter into that final discussion without first establishing these principles, because these are important when we get to the last discussion. Recently, when I said I heard these denominations out there saying this, that you have no scriptural authority to refuse, I believe they're in violation of the scriptures with that. And now I'm jumping ahead of myself because I'm telling you what the last lesson is going to be about. But I've already shown that the scriptures do provide a place where you can refuse adherence or mandates from the government if those mandates are violating the commands of God. But there is also one other area that I didn't include in here, and that is matters of opinion. There is a place within God's word that allows us as individual Christians to practice things of our own that do not violate the commands of God, nor impose upon anyone else a command, but it's a personal choice of our own. And as such, it can be something that we have strong beliefs about, and we can participate in and object to being forced out of those things. And we'll take a look at that when we get there in a couple of weeks. All right. So I hope this has been helpful. I know that I spoke on this when we were dealing with things previous, but I want us to look at this from a biblical perspective and just say, what does the scriptures, because most people are arguing it, oftentimes they argue it from a governmental viewpoint. We don't argue it that way. We're going to look at the Bible and says, what does the Bible say? Is there room for us to do it this way or not? What does the scriptures teach about this? And then make our determination from that. Because ultimately, the will of God trumps any man-made document out there. His command is over any of those. And so we have to be willing to begin there and end there. So with that, we want to offer the Lord's invitation. God sent his son to save us from this sinful world. And oh Lord, it is a sinful world. The things that we see out there today is just disturbing. And it's easy for us to get caught up into those things, to be part of those things. But God calls us out of that world. He calls us to be part of his eternal kingdom. And he sent his son so that we could do that. He gave us what we need in the sacrifice of Christ on the cross. The means to forgiveness. The means to be right with him so that we can spend eternity with him. That is his goal for his creation. His goal was not for us to live the sin that we live, to invent the sins that we invent, Romans chapter 1. That was never his goal. That was man's choice. But God calls us back to him. If you believe that Jesus is the Son of God, then you started on that right path. But it's more than simply belief. There has a need for us, a call for us to turn away from sin, repent, change of mind, change of direction. And then to confess that Jesus is the Christ, acknowledge who he is. Not that he's just some prophet, some wise man, but that he is the Son of God, God in the flesh. And then be baptized, buried with him. For that's the command, to be buried with Christ in a watery grave so that we can rise to walk in newness of life, Romans chapter 6 and verse 4. And then live faithful. Faithful to the cause of Christ. If you haven't done that, this is an opportunity for you. Don't miss this opportunity. There'll come a time when you won't have a chance for this opportunity. Your life will end. The Lord will come back. You know, recently I got a text message from somebody pleading for their parents here in town. I know these people. I've known them off and on for years. Met them. Pleading for their parents to obey the gospel. They're members of the church, their parents. But now their dad is in a home, and he's getting weaker, and he still refuses. And then he got to a point where you couldn't even get him down into the water. They wouldn't allow it. And now that hope is taken from him. Because of his refusal to do it when he had an opportunity. Just kept putting it off, wasn't going to do it, then he couldn't do it. Because of his choices. So sometimes we put ourselves in that situation. Sad, but we do. So if we can encourage you to obey the gospel today, do that. And if we can encourage you as a Christian to remain faithful to God, let's do that. It's not enough to go down those waters and come back up and say, hey, I'm saved. God calls us to faithfulness all the days of our life. So if we can encourage you, help you to make that walk, let's do that. Whatever you need is, come forward as we stand and sing.